Hello and welcome back to the course. Today we'll be testing out our state machine our new code templates to create a new stomp mechanic for our character. I've set up a little flowchart so we can actually kind of see how the transition should look, and then I've set up some pseudocode so we can actually see what checks we need to make. This is kind of mostly a little experiment and a way that I can actually show off how we can start adding to our new state machine and how easy it is to add to it. Anyway, let's load up the flowchart and then we'll start making the mechanic. So here's the current flowchart that we have for our finite state machine, right? We have our finite state machine here. It controls the transitions. We go from idle into walk or into jump, and then walk can go back into idle and into fall. I don't know why that link isn't made. There we go. And then idle can go into jump, jump can go into fall. Fall can only go into, or really come from jump or walk, and that's just kind of how it works. Now, looking at this, we can kind of get a good idea of where we want to put our quote-unquote stomp state. Now, our stomp state is going to be something that is like the Mario or the Super Mario stomp, right, where you jump and you jump onto their heads and it bounces and kind of does that. So with that knowledge, where would that go? Well, logically, that would go around here, so just after our fall state. So whilst we're falling, we would go into our jump state, or our stomp state, sorry. And then from there, we'll do a couple of checks, see what's happening, and then kind of move on. Now, I've actually set up the pseudocode over here, so we can kind of see it a little bit easier. So we go from our jump state into our fall state, and then our fall state goes into our stomp state after a certain requirement has been met. And then it checks, have we hit something? No? Okay, go into either the walk or the idle state depending on if we are touching a button or touching the floor. If it has hit something, go back into the bounce state. The bounce state is just going to go, it's going to basically touch their heads and then bounce off of them like a kind of half jump. And then we can kind of keep repeatedly bouncing on their heads. And that's kind of how I want it done. So after the bounce state, we'll go back into the full state and we'll kind of hit this little loop again where we check. And if we hit something else, we'll bounce. And if we don't, we'll go back into walk and idle. It's really that simple. And the best part is there is like a good, decent amount of code to go into this. And yet where we've done our templates and a lot of handlers, we don't actually need to do much coding. It's kind of amazing. And that's one of the things I love about this little project and how we set it up so far. As I was kind of recreating this and actually getting it to like work properly, I realized how quickly I was doing it and how little I actually have to do to set this up. So let's move back into the project and kind of put this into action. Now that we're in our project, we're first going to want to go and kind of go from where the loop starts, and the loop will start at the fall state specifically. So there's two easy ways of getting to that. We could go through our state machine folder here, go down into player states, and then go into the player full state. Or if you're a little bit like you don't really want to go through the file system, you can go to your entity container, open the player scene, and then open the full state script like this. We're going to actually need the player entity and the full state script anyway, so I may as well keep them both open. Now we're going to want to add a new signal to our full state. So this is going to be the thing that actually enters our stomp state. So we'll go signal enter underscore stomp underscore state, not stop. Stomp state, there we go. And now we're going to need to actually go and do a quick check down here. So the check is going to be relatively simple. We're just going to write if player entity dot velocity is greater than something. So this question mark here we're going to kind of think about real quick. If we set it at 0, we will actually transition from jump to fall to stomp nearly instantaneously after we, start moving upwards or downwards in this case. We actually need velocity.y. There we go. So once our y velocity is moving in the positive side, which means we are actually falling, we will kind of immediately transition from fall to stomp. We don't actually want it to immediately transition to fall to stomp because then we don't really have access to our full state for as long, and we might want to add things to our full state. So we could do 50 or 50 units, and 50 units is quite okay, but where we are immediately kind of setting our velocities as it goes up, like it's kind of interpolating between 0 and whatever our speeds are, we might actually want to set that a bit higher. Now, I actually have this preset to 100 usually. Now this is a bit of a magic number, but it's an okay magic number to use. We can go and set a export up here to actually change this on the fly if we really want to. Let's go and do that. We'll go export var full underscore, no, not full. Actually, yeah, we'll go stomp underscore transition underscore point. There we go. And we'll just typecast this as an float, and we'll set it equal to the equals as an equals of 100.0. There we go. So now we have this float for stomp transition point, and we can just throw that down there instead of just 100. So if the velocity is greater than the stomp transition point, we then want to do something, right? We want to emit the enter stomp signal. So enter stomp state dot emit, and that begins our loop. So we now have the enter stomp state and the signal set up and the actual point that we want it to kind of fire. So that means we get to now move on to our stomp state and actually start creating that. Now we get to do this in a very, very quick and easy way. Because we set up code templates in the last video, if you haven't watched that video, I really suggest you go back and look at it. It's extremely useful for our state machine. What we do is we right click on the folder here, hit create new, create a script. We'll name this the player stomp state, and before we hit create, we change the inherits up here to player state, toggle a template for the default player state here, and then hit create, and there is all of our pseudocode, or all of our actual code set up and sorted. The entire state is done. All we have to do now is add a class underscore name to it. So we'll add the class name of player stomp state. And now we just got to think about what we actually want to do. Well, let's think about our transitions first, right? So if we go back and we look at our little flowchart, we want to transition from the to the idle state, because that would just be faster than the walk state. So we'll transition to the idle state, or we want to transition to the bounce state, which means the two signals we will need will be enter idle and enter bounce. So let's go and create those signals very quickly. So signal enter underscore, we'll do enter idle state first, idle underscore state, and then another signal for enter underscore bounce underscore state. So that's our signal setup. Now, we're also going to need access to a hurt box for this, right? We are going to need to give our player an actual hurt box so we can start hurting enemies. So what I'm going to do here is what we usually do is we do this through the player entity. Now, because of what this actually is, it can be a bit buggy if you do it just through the player entity because of how the player entity gets set and a few other things. So what we're actually going to do is we're just going to do an exported variable. So export var, and we're just going to call this the stomp underscore box underscore handler. So we know exactly what it is. It's the stomp box. It's the box that's going to do the stomping. We'll typecast this as a hurt box handler, and we'll set it equal to null. And now we can kind of do our coding. But first, what we're going to do is we're going to go into our handlers container on our player entity here. We're going to highlight it, hit Control-Shift-A. We'll add a hurt box handler to it. I'm going to rename, actually, we'll keep it as hurt box handler so we know exactly what it is. We can rename this to the stomp box handler like we have it named in the thing, just so we kind of know, or we can keep it as hurt box. It's entirely your choice. And after we've done that, we need to right click on it, hit editable children so we can see the collision shape. We'll go to the 2D screen here so we can actually give it a collision shape. I'm going to give it a square collision shape, then I'm going to shrink this a little bit on the bottom and then on the sides by 2 pixels. I feel like this is just a good kind of collision shape to have. It's close enough where it looks like the character actually stands on their head and bounces off, and it's small enough to not be a bit too, I guess, janky or broken. So that's our stomp box handler done. Let's hit Control S and save. Let's go back into the script. So we have this done. We're just going to need to set it when we add the state, which we won't do just yet. But with that ready, we can now go down into our ready function of our stomp state. We can add the stomp box handler dot area entered signal, because we're going to want to check for the hitbox on the enemy that we want to actually, attack or stomp onto. So we want to check for that. So we'll do area enter dot connect, and now we will connect that to the on underscore stomp underscore hit signal or function. Come all the way down to the bottom of our script, a couple of new lines, create the on stop hit function. It's going to need an area of type. So it needs an area of type area 2D, but what we can do is use an area of type hitbox handler. Now, the reason we can actually do that is because one, we want to check for hitboxes only, and two, hitbox handlers actually inherit from areas, so it will actually allow this to kind of function. Void return type. And now in here, we just need to do a quick check, and this is going to check if we want to go into our bounce state, right? If the actual stomp box or our hurt box for this actually collides with something, then we have actually hit an enemy, and we need to make sure that if we are actually bouncing, we go into our bounce state. So to do that, we're going to do a bit of a backwards check. We'll go if not is, or if area, sorry, if area, wow. So we just want to do a really quick check. We'll write if not area is hitbox handler return. What this is basically going to say is if the area that we're actually hitting is not a hitbox handler, then return, but we are already specifically looking for hitbox handlers. This shouldn't really be necessary, but it's a worthwhile check just in case in the future we do something and it can mess with other things. This is just kind of creating some real safety for us, so when we do change things, nothing breaks. Yes, now that we've done that check, we just want to emit that enter bounce state signal. There you go, so enter bounce state.emit. Now that's the leaving done. We now need to do the rest of the kind of code that we want to do here. And well, one of the very first things here is if I actually go into the editor, go into debug and then visible collision shapes, and then I actually hit play and play the game, you'll see that this box is now always enabled. That is a little bit of a problem. We don't want it always enabled. In fact, we only want it enabled when we are within the stomp state. So how do we go about kind of changing that? Well, it's actually really simple because of how state machines function, right? State machines will run code when they enter, exit, and during, which means what we can do here is on the enter of this, we can actually call our stopbox handler and then grab its collision shape with a dot accessor. And then all we got to do is write dot disabled afterwards and then set that equal to false. So this is going to make it so the collision box actually runs, right? Which means we now need to think about how do we enable it? Or how do we disable it? Well, once again, we can go into the exit state. We can call the stomp box handler dot collision shape 2D dot disabled and then set that equal to true. So this will make it so our stomp box is enabled, and this will make it so it's disabled. That's it. Our stomp box will now forever be switching back and forth. Good. But there is one issue with this. When we actually bounce on something and we want to switch, it's going to be trying to do way too much in a single physics frame. And then you're going to get this little red error pop up that won't crash your game, but it will say, hey, struggling here, give me hand, more or less. And the way of actually stopping that error from popping up is, instead of just doing disabled like this, is we do something we've done before, where we use stompbox handler dot collision shape dot set underscore deferred. And then we just use the string name for disabled by just calling disabled like so, and then we pass in true. This will actually make it so you don't get any errors and it disables properly when it should. So that's the enter and exit handled. Now we need to do some things in our physics process. So what we're going to want to do in our physics process, we're going to want to make sure our character keeps moving, right? We don't want it so it locks up when we are going into the stomp state. We had this issue with the full state before, where a character would just kind of stop moving left and right, and then you just kind of fall up and down. It was kind of not great. So we know we want our character moving. So let's get that happening. We'll use the player entity dot movement handler that we set up in the past, and then use dot handle movement, passing in the three variables we need, which is the player entity, the player entity dot input handler dot handle movement, and then finally pass through delta. And that will get our character actually moving. I can remove this pass because I don't need it anymore. And now we need to actually go and do another check, right? Because we've got our check for if we're bouncing on something, but we also need a transition for if we want to enter the idle state. And we've done this check many times in the past. If you remember that check, I really suggest you pause the video, go and type it out, make sure it works for yourself. Like, type it out and then you can unpause the video and see what I've done. It's a good way of getting it just kind of set in your head. So I'll let you do that, and I'll start doing it myself. All we want to do is check if the player entity dot is on floor variable, so the is on floor true false boolean that it automatically has is set to true. And if it is, then all we do is enter the idle state dot emit, and that is our entire stomp state actually done. That's it. This handles everything. This is the entire stomp state done. It will do everything it actually needs to now, and this gets even better if we want to go and actually test this. Now, to test this, we're going to need to do kind of something specific, right? We have our hurtbox handler, which means it needs to do two things. One, if we go to the stomp box on our player here and we highlight it, we can actually go down to collision, and we need to change its layer and mask. So it doesn't need to actually exist on any layer or any mask. It just needs to be looking, well, it needs to exist on a mask, not a layer. It needs to be looking for the enemy masks. It wants to be looking for enemy hitboxes, and enemy hitboxes exist on the enemy mask, or yeah, which is in this case mask 3. So that's set up. Okay. What else do we need to get this running? Well, once again, it needs to have or be connected or be able to connect to or find enemy hitboxes. Enemy hitboxes, or enemies actually don't have hitboxes right now, so we need to go add those. So we go to our patroller enemy.tscn here. So we can open this up. We go into the 2D here, and we'll see it has a hurtbox because it does damage to our player, but it doesn't have a hitbox. So let's use Control-Shift-A and add, and we'll add a hitbox handler. We'll go and set up the editable children here. Once again, the collision shape. Now, another thing about game development when it comes to setting up enemies and hitboxes and things like that is you always want your enemies' hitboxes to be larger than the actual enemy themselves. It just feels more fair if you do it that way. So what I'm going to do is this. So what you'll see here is these let's remove this collision shape, the central one. So what we've got here is the inner circle is the enemy's damage radius. And then the outer circle is where it can actually get hit, right? And we want the outer circle to be a bit bigger than the inner circle. Why? Because when the character actually lands on this hitbox, it wants to do damage and then bounce off. We don't want the character to actually take damage when landing on the enemy. Now, this specific enemy actually has a spike on its head, so eventually we will change what the patroller enemy looks like to not have a spike on its head, otherwise players might actually look at that and go, oh, that will probably hurt me if I jump on it. And that's just a spriting issue, but we don't really need to think about that in the development stage at the moment. That's more a bit later visual stuff that we can change. But yes, so that's that handled. We have our hitbox handler. Now, what else does the hitbox handler need to function? Well, we can click on it, and we can see that this requires a health handler and an invulnerability time. Well, I'm going to set the invulnerability time first to 0.2, because that might feel good, and we'll go test it. Now we need to give it a health handler. Okay, so let's highlight our patroller enemy, hit Control-Shift-A and add. We'll add a health handler to our enemy. I'm going to move that up to where all of our handlers are. So up here, I'm going to probably node these in a refactoring video eventually, like compress them all down into one node, which would be nice. So we have a health handler. It's going to need some health. I'm going to give it 1 HP, and this is going to need a type and a death handler assigned. Okay, let's set the type to enemy. Hit Control-S and save. And now let's go and set up our death handler. So Control-Shift-A on the patroller enemy, the death handler, pull that up to where our health handler is. Death handler needs a parent, click that, assign the patroller enemy because that is the parent overall. Now go to the health handler, assign that to the death handler, And finally, go back down to the hitbox and assign the health handler, like so. And that is the entire kind of enemy sorted now. This enemy can now take damage and it can now die. Look at how fast and simple that actually was because of the OOP methods we're using, the handler system, and the state machine system that we're using. We've just set up an entire combat system, or at least, well, yeah, combat system for our game in the span of, I would assume, maybe 15 minutes. I don't actually have a timer going, but I'm going to say about 15 minutes, probably 20. But yeah, it's that simple. Now, we do need to finalize some things, right? We need to go and finalize two things. One, we need to change our hitbox on our patroller enemy's collision here. We want to change this to only exist on the enemy layer. Hit Control S and save. And now we're going to need to go and add our bounce state, I guess. Yeah, we just need to go to our bounce state. That's it. Now, I could go and test this. Let's go check what our health handler is set at on the enemy here. Let's go health handler. It's set at 1. I'm going to hit play, run over to the health handler and bonk. And it immediately deletes the enemy. That's great. The player entity's collision shape here needs to be preset disabled. There we go. And we need to actually add our full state into, or our stomp state into our player here. So let's go and add that. The reason why the stomp state immediately worked is because we had the stomp box handler already running. Oh yeah. So to add to the state machine, we need to highlight the state machine, hit Control A, not Control Shift A, Control A, and then we want to type in player, and if you just do player S, you'll pop up with the player stomp state. We add that. This is going to need the stomp box handler so it can control the stomp box handler. Now we need to go up to the top of our scene here, click the player script, and we now need to actually add the, if I go down to here, our state machine region where all of our states are, we need to go and add the player stop state. Typecast that as a player stomp state. There we go. Now we can scroll down to the bottom here where we're handling all of our state signals. This is kind of why we separate it out into a function. As you can see, this function is slowly starting to get quite long, and all it's doing is just setting a bunch of signals. So we'll add a new line here and we'll start adding signals. Well, we know that our player full state needs to have its enter stomp state signal connected to start our stomp loop. So enter stomp state dot connect player state machine dot change state dot bind, and then in here we can add our player stomp state. So we're now within our stomp state, which means we can go from our player stomp state to the, we'll go to the idle state first. So we can actually get out of the stomp state, and because we don't have our bounce state, and this is just mostly for testing. So we want to enter idle state and then use dot connect. Once again, player state machine. This really becomes kind of a rhythm that you get into when it comes to adding to the state machine, although I can't seem to type correctly right now. Here we go, player state machine dot change state dot bind, and then pass through the player idle state. And then finally we need to go into the bounce state, but we don't have one of those created yet, so we won't worry about it. Let's go into the game and check. So you see the square hitbox here is disabled, it's grayed out, and then when we go into our full state after falling for just a little bit, it enables and it's done. So we can go and stomp on some enemies and it works. And as you can see, our health is not going down, but we did get a little error. Let's go figure out what that is. Well, yep, I seriously cannot figure out why that error is appearing. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I will have to do some bug testing on that. It never really, there it goes again. It never appeared before when I was testing this, so this is actually quite interesting. So that's probably what we're going to do for now, is we're just going to check if this area is of area 2D, and then we will check if it is a hitbox handler afterwards. So what this will do is just return if that happens, I guess. Yeah. And it's never hitting that return point. Let's go and actually make sure that it's hitting the if check, and it's hitting the if check or the breakpoint. That's how you use breakpoints to debug, by the way. You just click the little red dot, And yeah, go and test the thing, get it to trigger, and if it triggers, it works. If it never actually triggers this if check, that means the function's not being ran, which means there's a problem in another place. Anyway, with that little debugging out of the way, very confusing, just change the area here to be an area 2D instead of a hitbox handler. I've never had that error pop up in the past. It seems a bit iffy on when it wants to pop up. I don't really entirely see what's triggering it, but we don't need to concern ourselves with that. Area 2D sorted, it doesn't break our game. If I can figure it out, I will create an entire video about kind of fixing it. Now, we can actually move on to our bounce and idle state. We've done our idle, we just need to do bounce now. So let's go and do our bounce state. To do that, we once again do the same thing we've done before, where we go into our state machine, player state, create a new script. We'll call this the player bounce state. Inherit it from the player state, default player state as our template, hit create. Go and find it, player stamp, that new script can go, remove that, there we go. Go to our player bounce state, go into our class name, call this the player bounce state, there we go. And now we can just kind of start changing our bounce state. So what are we going to want for our bounce state? Well, we're going to want the ability to actually bounce, right? Now, the easiest way for us to actually go and get the ability to bounce is to go into our jump handler and check the code here, because we are already bouncing technically, we're just jumping. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to add a function for handling the bounce inside the jump handler. Since this kind of handles a lot of our Y-related velocity, it's kind of a good place to put it. We could create an entire handler for bouncing alone, and we may do that in the future if I feel like it's absolutely necessary. But for now, this works. So let's go bounce underscore speed. There we go. Now we can give this a float, set that equal to, I'm going to set this equal to around 200. I've tried 100, 150. 150 feels okay, but it's not great. 200 feels better. 220 was the mark that I actually found that works, but we'll try 200. Now we need to create a new function for this, right? We'll create a new function. This will be for handle underscore bounce. And we can kind of just look at this code here and figure out what it's doing, right? So what does it need? Well, it's going to need a character underscore body, and it's going to be of type character body 2D. And then it's going to need a boolean for is underscore bouncing, because this boolean is pretty much just like a null check of sorts. It's just an unnecessary check to be there, but safety checks, that's the one. So we'll give this a void return type, and we'll go from here. So the code for this is if is jumping and character body is on floor, so we're on the floor, and then the is jumping equals true, do the jump. For this, all we have to do is if is bouncing is equal to true, so we can set it like this, or we can just do is bouncing for shorthand, and then we can write character body dot velocity dot y minus the, or equals minus bounce speed, and that sets up our bouncing. Now I want to very quickly say this, the reason why I'm using long form in here of actually writing character underscore body rather than like CB or just player, it's because for functions like this, when you're actually calling them in a different script, being able to have the parameters highlighted and actually called like character body will allow you to kind of know immediately what to put in, right? So it will pop up with, okay, it needs a character body and an is bouncing, and then it'll like give the types next to it as well. So we'll know it's a bool and a character body 2D. It's just easier like that, or at least easier to read. So that's our bouncing handled here. Let's go back into our bounce state and actually start adding our bounces to this. Well, first we want to think about what this loops into, right? Once again, go check our little flowchart. Well, this goes straight back into the full state, and that's it. It only goes into the full state. Okay. With that said, we can just go and add it into our full state. So signal, enter, underscore full underscore state. I'll put a new line there to make it look a bit prettier. And now we can kind of look into our code. Well, this is relatively simple, right? We just wanted to run a specific function. Well, we can do that the minute we enter the state here in the enter state function. So we'll use player entity dot jump handler dot, and now we want to do what? Well, we create a new function for this. We can go handle underscore bounce, which is not appearing. If it doesn't appear, go back, hit Control S in the script a couple of times, and then try typing it out again. There you go, handle bounce. It's going to need the player entity and a boolean for true, so it is bouncing. We want that set to true. And yeah, now we just handle the physics process and calling the exit signal. Well, what do we want to do in this? Well, we want to be moving, so we want the player entity dot movement handler dot handle movement. We know that we need to pass in a character body, an input direction, and a delta. So we'll pass through a player entity as the character body, the player entity dot input handler dot handle movement as the input directions, and then we can just pass through delta. So that's our handle movement sorted. Now let's handle the leaving of this state, okay? So we just want to check if the player entity dot velocity dot y is greater than 0. And then we can emit our enter full state here. So enter full state dot emit. So here's a question. Answer this one yourselves. Why do we want the velocity check to be above 0? Well, why are we checking this if we want to enter the falling state? If you said because going up or positive in numbers with velocity actually means you're going down, correct. We want to go straight back into our falling state. So we could actually do this negatively and go into the jumping state if we would prefer. That would make a little bit more sense, but because we're handling a bounce, the bounce is kind of a subset of a jump, right? We don't want it to actually jump our character. We only want it to bounce. So we want to go from bounce to fall, because after the velocity starts going down, we'll go from bounce to fall. Done. Yeah, that is our stomp and bounce state sorted. This is really quick. I apologize if I'm going fast. This feels fast. And I don't know if it's because I'm actually going quickly. If I am, I apologize. If it's just because this is very kind of quick and easy to set up, then it's just very surprising to me. And now, to finish it off, all we have to do is what? Well, add it to our actual state machine, okay? Highlight state machine, Control A, find the player bounce state, double click on that. Let's go to the 2D scene, Control S and save. Check what the bounce state needs nothing. Everything is actually set up well, other than the signal connection in the player entity. So, as per usual, I'm going to close this region here. The state machine region that we set up before, what do we need to add? Well, we need to add a reference to the player bounce. So as player bounce state. Now we can scroll all the way back down and go to where we're handling our signals. And then from the player stomp state, we are going into the idle state. So we want to make sure that we can go from the player stomp state into the bounce state to actually get our loop to finish slowly. So connect this to the player state machine, dot change state, dot bind, and then we want to bind in the player bounce state. So once again, to just go over that, player stomp state, dot enter bounce state, we want to go from stomp to bounce. And then we bind all of that together. And then finally, we want to grab our player bounce state, dot enter full state, and connect that to the player state machine, dot change state, dot bind, and bind that into the player full state. And that should be our loop done. That should genuinely be our loop done. Let's actually go and test it. So I can go jump on their heads, and I bounce off of their heads. Can I move around? I can. Now we've got this really satisfying, I don't know why, when I was creating this and testing this, I sat here and I actually just tested it for about 10 minutes because it's just really satisfying to bounce off of their heads. I'm going to go to the patroller enemy, to its health handler. I'm going to change this to 3 to give like 3 bounces basically, because we're only doing 1 damage. So 1, 2, 3. The hitbox resets quickly enough. And there's our little error popping up again. I'm going to have to go back through and figure out why this is actually happening. This shouldn't be happening. But yes, we can ignore this for now, and I will, in a different video, kind of go through why this is happening. But anyway, this actually handles the entire attack system. We're done. That's the Stomp state done. I hope you have enjoyed. I really hope this wasn't too quick. If it was, I will kind of slow down in the future. But yeah, I hope you've had fun. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you're actually kind of learning a lot from this series, and I hope you are having a great game dev journey, and I will see you in the next video.